Today, Crater Lake looks almost too peaceful to have been born from violence. Its water sits inside a vast ring of cliffs in southern Oregon, nearly 2,000 feet deep and intensely blue. But before the lake existed, another landscape stood here. A mountain rose roughly 12,000 feet above sea level, towering more than a mile above the surface of the water we see today. Then, about 7,700 years ago, that mountain disappeared. Modern geology explains how it happened. A catastrophic eruption emptied so much magma from beneath the volcano that its summit could no longer support itself. The center collapsed, leaving an enormous basin that slowly filled with rain and snow. But long before geologists reconstructed that event, the Klamath people were already preserving a story about a mountain destroyed by fire. They spoke of red-hot rocks hurled through the sky, of the ground trembling, of burning material racing down the slopes. And when the sun finally rose, the great mountain was gone. That is not a vague resemblance. It is uncomfortably close to what scientists now say happened here. So the question is not merely how Crater Lake formed. The deeper question is whether a story carried through generations could preserve the human memory of one of the most violent volcanic eruptions North America has experienced in the last several thousand years. Before we go further, if you are drawn to the moments when ancestral memory and physical evidence begin describing the same event, consider subscribing. That is where this channel lives, not in forcing an answer, but in following the records until the easy explanations run out. To understand the Klamath account, we first need to remove Crater Lake from the landscape. Imagine standing in southern Oregon before the eruption. There is no circular basin, no wizard island rising from blue water, no cliffs surrounding an empty space. Instead, a massive volcanic complex dominates the region. The mountain we now call Mount Mazama had been growing through repeated eruptions for hundreds of thousands of years. Layers of lava, ash, and volcanic debris had gradually built a steep, glaciated peak reaching approximately 12,000 feet. The name Mount Mazama is relatively modern. It was applied in the late 19th century, connected to the Mazama's mountaineering organization. The people whose ancestors knew this landscape long before that name existed had their own relationships with the mountain and the lake that eventually occupied it. Crater Lake is known as Giwas in the Klamath language. The Klamath and Modoc people, the Yahuskin band of northern Paiute Indians, and the Cow Creek band of Umpqua Indians all maintain deep cultural connections with the region. Their ancestors used the wider landscape for hunting, gathering, temporary camps, spiritual practice, and journeys to places considered unusually powerful. For many Klamath people, this was never simply beautiful scenery. It was a place where the ordinary world met something more dangerous and sacred. Historical accounts describe Crater Lake as a landscape that demanded preparation. Not everyone was supposed to approach it casually. Certain people visited to seek visions or undertake spiritual tests, but the mountain's power was not treated as entertainment for outsiders. That point matters because later visitors often interpreted silence as ignorance. Early settlers did not immediately receive a complete explanation of the lake from native communities. Some eventually assumed the people living around the region had no knowledge of it. The surviving record suggests something very different. The knowledge was there. The place was simply not theirs to interrogate. One recorded Klamath account describes a conflict between two powerful beings. Llao was the chief of the below world. His home was associated with the interior of the earth and the mountain that stood where Crater Lake is today. Skell was the chief of the above world, connected with the sky and, in some versions, with Mount Shasta farther south. According to the version presented by the National Park Service, Llao sometimes emerged from beneath the earth and stood upon the summit of the great mountain. During one of these visits, he saw the daughter of a Makalak chief and wanted her to return with him to his lodge below the mountain. He promised her eternal life. She refused. Llao's response was not quiet disappointment. He threatened her people and began hurling fire down from the mountain. Skell came to their defense. From the two mountaintops, the chiefs fought with a violence large enough to transform the landscape. The account describes red-hot rocks as large as hills flying through the sky. The earth shook. Burning landslides moved across the country while frightened people fled toward Klamath Lake. Then two holy men made a sacrifice. They climbed the mountain and threw themselves into the fiery opening. Their courage moved Skell, who forced Llao back beneath the mountain. When daylight returned, the peak was gone. A vast hole remained where the mountain had stood. Rain fell and gradually filled the depression with water. That became Crater Lake. There are different versions of this tradition, as we should expect from an account transmitted orally over many generations. The Umpqua people also preserved a story associated with the destruction of the mountain, though different spiritual figures appear in their telling. That variation does not automatically weaken the tradition. Oral history does not usually behave like a government report copied word for word. It moves through families, ceremonies, responsibilities, and cultural settings. Meaning can be preserved even when names, emphasis, or details change. Still, we have to be careful. The story cannot be treated as a modern scientific description written thousands of years ago. Llao and Skell belong to a sacred cultural framework. Their conflict carries spiritual meaning that cannot be reduced to magma pressure and collapsing rock. But when the physical details are separated from the interpretations surrounding them, something remarkable remains. A high mountain, fire rising from its summit, hot rocks falling from the sky, the earth shaking, burning material moving down the slopes, the mountain collapsing, and water eventually occupying the whole. That sequence is very close to the one reconstructed by modern volcanologists. The geological version begins below the mountain. For thousands of years, molten rock had accumulated within a magma reservoir beneath Mount Mazama. The volcano had experienced earlier episodes of activity, including eruptions roughly 2 centuries before the final collapse that produced thick lava flows and layers of pumice near what are now Llao Rock and Cleetwood Cove. Then came the climactic eruption. It began from a vent on the northeastern side of the volcano. A towering column of ash, pumice, gas, and broken volcanic rock rose approximately 30 miles into the atmosphere. Imagine what that would have looked like to anyone close enough to witness it. The daylight would have dimmed. Ash would have fallen across the land. The mountain would have seemed to connect the earth to a dark, expanding sky. Winds carried the ash throughout the Pacific Northwest and into parts of what is now southern Canada. The Mazama ash layer became so extensive and recognizable that archaeologists and geologists still use it as a regional marker in the earth. As the eruption intensified, the column could no longer remain suspended. It collapsed. That did not mean the mountain itself fell immediately. The eruption column fell back toward the earth, creating fast-moving currents of superheated gas, ash, and volcanic debris. These are known as pyroclastic flows. They traveled down valleys in nearly every direction, reaching distances of roughly 43 miles from the volcano. Some valleys were filled with deposits of pumice and ash approaching 300 feet in thickness. This is one of the details I keep returning to. The traditional account does not simply describe fire above the mountain. It also describes fiery landslides moving across the ground. A person watching a pyroclastic flow without modern scientific vocabulary would not see a density current of hot gas and tephra. They would see a wall of burning earth racing down the mountain. And if they survived, that may be exactly how they remembered it. The eruption then entered another phase. Circular fractures opened around the upper portion of the mountain. These ring-shaped vents allowed enormous volumes of material to escape from the magma reservoir below. As the chamber emptied, the rock above it lost support. The upper portion of Mount Mazama began collapsing inward. This was not a single peak simply exploding into nothing. It was the structural failure of an enormous section of the volcano. The central mass sank into the space left by the removed magma, forming a caldera between approximately 5 and 6 miles across and about 7/10 of a mile deep. The mountain had not vanished without leaving a trace. Its broken remains formed the walls around the empty basin, but to someone viewing the landscape afterward, the result would have been unmistakable. The summit that had dominated the region was gone. The lake did not appear instantly. After the main eruption ended, rain and melting snow slowly accumulated inside the caldera. Smaller eruptions continued within the basin. Lava and volcanic material formed new features, most of which are now hidden below the surface. Wizard Island is the visible remnant of one of those later volcanic cones, but the portion above the water represents only a small part of the structure. It took centuries for the basin to approach its later water level. Volcanic activity continued inside the caldera. and the last known eruption occurred around 4,800 years ago. So when the traditional account says rain eventually filled the hole, it compresses a long natural process into the scale of a story. That is not surprising. Oral traditions rarely preserve geological time in measured centuries. They preserve sequence. The mountain stood, fire came, the land collapsed, water replaced it. Of course, similarity alone is not proof that the surviving story has passed unchanged from the night of the eruption to the present. No written Klamath document exists from 7,700 years ago. We cannot place an ancient recording device beside the witnesses. We cannot compare today's version with the exact words spoken one generation after the catastrophe. And this is where honest investigation becomes more difficult. A story can absorb later knowledge. Details can be added after people observe a landscape and attempt to explain it. A mountain spirit throwing fire is also a powerful symbol that could emerge without direct memory of one particular eruption. There is another problem. Many indigenous traditions were written down by outsiders long after European contact. Anthropologists, missionaries, park interpreters, and historians did not always understand the language or cultural setting. Some simplified what they heard. Others forced traditions into categories that made sense to them. Even the familiar Llao and Skell version should not be mistaken for the only Klamath understanding of Crater Lake. The National Park Service itself notes that multiple versions exist. That caution is necessary. Without it, respect becomes another form of exploitation, using a sacred story only because it resembles a dramatic scientific event. But the physical evidence does establish one thing that cannot be dismissed easily. People were present in the region before Mount Mazama collapsed. Archaeologists have found sandals and other artifacts beneath the layers of ash, dust, and pumice deposited by the eruption. The evidence does not show a permanent village on the summit. The National Park Service describes the area as a place used for temporary camping, rather than a continuous settlement. Even so, someone was there. Human beings traveled, gathered, camped, and lived within the world affected by the eruption. They were not thousands of miles away hearing a distant sound. Communities occupied the wider landscape before ash buried traces of their presence. The National Park Service states that Klamath and Umpqua oral traditions indicate that people witnessed Mount Mazama's eruption. Scholars examining relationships between indigenous knowledge and geology have also identified the Klamath accounts as traditions that appear to correlate with the event. The ash itself provides a boundary in time. Above it lies the world after Mount Mazama. Below it lies the world before Crater Lake. When an artifact is found beneath that layer, its position matters. The ash becomes a date marker spread across thousands of square miles. It tells archaeologists that human activity occurred before the climactic eruption covered the land. The tradition and the archaeology do not prove each other in a perfect circle. The artifacts do not mention Llao. The story does not provide a scientific date, but together they remove the easiest dismissal, the idea that no one could possibly have witnessed the event because no people were living there. People were there. What they remembered is the more difficult question. Can a memory survive for almost 8,000 years? Not as a sentence repeated perfectly, probably not, but perhaps as a structure. A mountain destroyed by fire, a terrifying force from below, survivors fleeing, a changed landscape, a place considered so powerful that future generations approached it with caution. Stories are not fossils. They remain alive because people retell them, interpret them, and apply them to the world around them. That makes them vulnerable to change, but it also allows them to survive in ways that written records sometimes do not. Paper burns, archives disappear, languages are suppressed. A story entrusted to a community can continue moving, and that, honestly, is the part that stays with me. For much of American history, oral knowledge was treated as something beneath written evidence. A settler's diary could become history. A surveyor's map could become fact. An indigenous account was often labeled legend before anyone examined what it might preserve. Crater Lake forces that hierarchy into an uncomfortable position. Modern geology did not prove the spiritual conflict between Llao and Skell. It could not. But geology did confirm that a mountain once stood there. that it released fire and stone into the sky, that burning flows raced across the land, that the earth collapsed, and that water eventually filled the immense depression left behind. Those are not minor similarities. They form the entire physical arc of the catastrophe. There is also a reason we should resist turning this into a simple victory story in which modern science finally declares an old tradition correct. The Klamath people did not need outsiders to validate the sacred importance of Giiwas, and the tradition is not valuable only because pieces of it resemble a geological report. It also preserves a human relationship with the event. Fear, sacrifice, danger, responsibility, and the belief that some places demand restraint. Science explains how the mountain collapsed. The traditional account tells us what such a catastrophe meant to the people whose world was changed by it. Those are not identical forms of knowledge, but they do not have to destroy one another. They can stand beside each other. One describes a magma chamber losing support. The other remembers a power beneath the mountain rising in anger. One describes pyroclastic flows. The other remembers landslides of fire. One measures a caldera. The other remembers the morning when the mountain was no longer there. The mistake would be forcing one account to become the other. The more interesting possibility is that each preserved something the other could not. Today, visitors arrive at Crater Lake and see stillness. They photograph the water. They stand at the rim. They look toward Wizard Island and try to understand the scale of the basin below. Very few can visualize the mountain that once occupied that empty space. The Klamath account begins with that missing mountain. It remembers the landscape before the lake became the landmark. Perhaps every detail changed during the long passage through generations. Perhaps spiritual meaning gathered around an older memory. Perhaps later knowledge influenced some of the versions that were eventually recorded. Those possibilities remain. But beneath the ash, archaeologists found evidence that people knew this landscape before the destruction. Within the story, the mountain burns, the earth shakes, the summit disappears, and the basin fills with water. And in the cliffs surrounding Crater Lake, geology preserves the same sequence in stone. That does not give us a perfect answer. It gives us something more valuable, a reason to listen carefully before dismissing an old account simply because it was preserved by voice rather than paper. The mountain did not disappear without witnesses. Someone saw the sky darken. Someone felt the ground move. Someone watched the familiar shape of the world collapse. And somehow, across nearly 8,000 years, a memory of that destruction may still be speaking. Do you think the Klamath account preserves a direct human memory of Mount Mazama's eruption? Or was the story shaped later by generations trying to explain the landscape around them? And did an elder in your own family ever preserve a story that turned out to contain more truth than people expected? Share it in the comments. If you return for investigations where ancestral memory, forgotten records, and physical evidence meet, subscribe. There are many more places across America where the oldest story may also be the first record.